Hello, this is Dr. Lindsay. And in this module, we're going to be going through this Keynesian model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. What we're doing is trying to create a model for the entire economy, to analyze the economy. And until the 1930s, there really was no model for analyzing the economy. And then John Maynard Keynes came along and he wrote his book. And he came up with a great model for how the economy works. For the most part, people still use that model today. At least everyone kind of understands it and uses it. It has flaws like all the models, but it's actually a fairly good model to use, even though it's got lots of flaws in it. It's a simple model. We just take demand and supply and apply it to the whole economy. The only difference is we call it aggregate demand and aggregate supply. I don't know how long the model will be around. It changes over time, slowly. The model that I will present to you is a little bit different than the book has, because it has been changing, but it hasn't made its way down to the textbooks yet. Now, as I said, before Keynes came out, his book in the 1930s, there really was no model of macroeconomics. And the model that we have now, as I said, it has flaws in it. If you came back and took an economics class 25, 30 years from now, maybe the model will be different. It might have changed. I hope it's changed and that progress is made to have better models. But this is what we have to work with. It's the easiest one to understand. The other models are more difficult. There's lots of macroeconomic models. Others are more difficult, and I don't really think they are any better or explain the economy any better than this Keynesian macroeconomics model. So the outline for this model is as follows. We'll go over the difference between the classical thinking, or the pre-Keynesian thinking, pre-1930s thinking, and then the Keynesian thinking, and how he looked at the economy differently. Then we'll go through what constitutes aggregate demand. So we're going to just take supply and demand, but apply it to the entire economy. But instead of calling this aggregate demand, we'll call it aggregate demand. The demand for everything in the economy. And for the upward sloping supply curve, we'll call it aggregate supply, the supply of everything in the economy. And then look for an equilibrium. And on the horizontal axis, we'll have quantity, just like before, but the quantity for everything in the economy is GDP, real GDP, which is also the same thing as total income for the economy, and the abbreviation we use for that is Y. On the vertical axis, we can put price or inflation. Older models used price, and now that's being changed into a slightly different model that has inflation on the vertical axis. Now, this model that we call the Keynesian model was originated by Keynes, but he actually just wrote a book and he didn't use very many equations or graphs at all. Other economists came along in the 30s and they converted what was in his book to graphs like this. And when Keynes saw these graphs, he said that he didn't think you could do that. Didn't think you could actually convert his works into this aggregate demand, aggregate supply analysis. But they did, and it kind of stuck. And one of my students read up on this, and one of the economists that converted this into graphs said it was kind of a crude model. It was more of a classroom gimmick. So we use this model, as I said, but it's got some flaws. It's somewhat of a crude model to explain how the economy works. So this is the Keynesian macroeconomic model. We're just using supply and demand, that's all. We're calling it aggregate demand and aggregate supply. In the short run, this aggregate supply curve is upward sloping, like a normal supply curve. But in the long run, it's vertical. At potential output or potential GDP. So we have a short run model and we have a long run model. And if we want, we can actually combine them and put them on one graph and look at the short run and the long run together. And that's referred to as a new Keynesian model. It's important to understand this model really well, because this is like what we strive to accomplish in a macroeconomics class, to develop this model that we can understand the economy with. And on the horizontal axis here is GDP, total output for the economy, and that's the reason for understanding having the module on GDP in measuring output. On this vertical axis, we'll use inflation. And that's another reason why we have an entire module on inflation, is to be able to understand and use this model to analyze the economy. We want to know what's going to happen if, how do we end up in a recession or a depression? How do we get out of it? How do we end up with deflation or a high amount of inflation? Well, we can use this model to kind of understand those things and figure out what we need to do to prevent them. Or what we can do as a society if we get into a depression, what we can do about it. And this model helps understanding that so we can do just that.